Okay, everybody, this is the UI meeting for Nephew SIG automation, and Chris is gonna run the show here.
Okay, excellent. You know what? Let me go ahead, share my desktop. Have you guys been able to watch the video, see how to set up the UI? I don't know if anyone has been able to successfully yet.
Yeah, I gone through the video. I need to make the setup. Maybe during this weekend I will try to do it.
Okay. Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to set up so I can share my screen. Okay, I think I have it up. You know what, not to repeat too much in the video, but let me get back to the Get Backstage. Okay, for anyone who hasn't seen this quite yet, within the repository itself, there is a README at the top level. The README describes like everything you need to have in order for the UI to set up the UI. So definitely Node.js, Yarn, Git, and then you also need a cluster with Porch on it. This does. I don't know if you guys have experience with React or not. I guess either way, it kind of follows like a similar setup to any other UI I've worked on, where first after you fork, you install the dependencies. Instead of npm, this uses Yarn, but Backstage uses, and then to run the UI, just simply yarn dev. So that's an executable within the package.json. And slightly repeating the video is within the hack folder is unless, so you got two options as far as you'll definitely need a cluster with Porch installed on it. So one option is you can have your own cluster. And if you want, you can install Porch manually, whatnot, that's completely great. That, or if you want to, you can use these scripts to automatically install Porch on the cluster. This is going to install the latest release of Porch within the KEP repo, and then as well as install package repositories. If you don't have a cluster that you want to use already, and for local development, I know this is a slightly different story once it's deployed for authentication reasons, but for local development, you can use any cluster that you can connect with using your kube control or kube config will work for local development. So that includes AWS, CloudShares, Azure. Another option is you can create a cluster within your local machine using Dyn. So that would work great too. So for my local setup, let's jump over. And right now I am pointed to the cluster I created with Kind. So let me start up the UI. And it just occurred to me, let me know if the screen is a little bit too small as far as font size or anything.
It is pretty tiny.
Yeah, okay, let me see if I can change the resolution. How's this?
I mean, it's readable. Yeah, it's small, but it's readable for me anyway.
Okay, you know what? Maybe I just do one.
Better.
Yeah, so I just realized that as I started going, because I know whenever I recorded that video, I took it down to I think 1080, which is approximately how bad's this? You know what? This should be fine. Okay. Okay, cool. So I started the UI using UronDev. I have it brought up. Okay, this looks functional. This looks good. Okay, cool. So whenever you bring up the UI, did this just change on me? Okay, so whenever you bring up the UI with the sample repositories, it's going to update your external blueprint. So you're going to have 3 different repositories here. If we jump into the Nephia free 5G C packages, we can see all the packages listed out within the repository. And then I'm just going to jump through a few forms or screens, and then I'll show you how it maps back to the source code, where to find that. But just to show you some of the functionality is, again, whenever we enter the repository, we can see all the various packages listed. We can click on a row to enter that package, so we can look at the operator. And then whenever we, let's look at this one deployment resource, and we can see information around the deployment. So we can see that it has several containers, looks like 2 containers. We can see the images that's being used, the image tag, args being passed, and what ports are being exposed, and so forth. And I know this is actually one of the screens I believe John's asking us to do for the upcoming release. And then if we switch the YAML view, is we can see the YAML view of the resource that we've opened up. And this works for essentially any element, at least any element that's well formatted, where the YAML is valid. So I open up a custom resource definition. So again, we can see information here as well as the YAML view. Okay, we can jump back. Let me see where to go from here. And then actually, before I jump back, we can see whenever we have a individual package open, is we can list out its various conditions. This happens to have none. We can see the various revisions, so a decent amount of functionality here. And of course, if we want, we can go ahead and we can clone this package to another repository. So locally, I've set up a team blueprint repository. So I added that about 5 minutes before this meeting. So let's go ahead and clone this. And I just add my name to it. And one important note here is whenever we clone it to one of my own repositories, skipped over this a little bit, but actually, let me just to jump back. The external blueprints as a whole, these repositories tend to be read-only, where you can't make any modifications to the packages or resources within these packages within this repository. Whereas whenever I cloned it to one of my repositories, I'm able to, if I want, I can add new packages, or in this case, team blueprints to this repository, or I can go in the actual package itself and I can make changes. So likewise, whenever I click on a resource, I get a viewer. Right now I'm in a view only, a read only mode. If I click edit, this is where we can see whenever I click on a particular resource. Let's go back to the deployment resource. I have a screen now that allows me to make modifications. So for instance, I can open up the deployment details. I can see, okay, what the update structure is. Actually, let's go to the pod details. Okay, we got 2 containers. If I really wanted to, I can increase, let's say, the version of one of these containers. Or I can change a tag from latest to, not sure this is a valid version, but or tag, but v10. And again, looking at, I think what John has noted for the upcoming release, the screen is, we want to extend the screen so it can work with an additional resource for Nephia. So just instead of deployments and some of the other basic resources, I know we want to extend this further. So I'll definitely show you where it's at within the code. Now I'm just showing you the functionality. And similar to the viewers, if I click on the show YAML view, we have a YAML view, or actually a YAML editor, where I can make changes within this form. I can switch back to, we call it the formatted or the resource viewer form, and I can see the changes were reflected back. Cool. So I think I'm going to jump back, and feel free to stop me at any point. Now I'm going to jump to the code and see if I can show you where all this is at within the code and how to start connecting everything. And I guess one other really important thing to mention is, So within Backstage, so Backstage allows you to develop, I think this is kind of taking it directly from the website, but developer portals are essentially mini applications or what they call plugins within the main Backstage application. So this entire window that we're looking at right now, this is within a Backstage application. And then this configures data as well as usually within Backstage, usually you see other options here. I've removed them just because they're not applicable for us. But we do have settings at the bottom where these are different plugins within Backstage that we're using. So settings plugin is a plugin developed by Backstage itself. So I don't have, let's say, direct control over this plugin other than saying, yes, I want to be able to show it. And I have some light customizations. Whereas the configures data UI, this plugin is once you click on it, I do own everything. So not necessarily this bar right here, the navigation bar, but I do own everything within the screen. So where is this?
And what we talked about recently anyway was that what might make sense for R1 is to Nefio specific functionality, to create a Nefio plugin for Nefio specific functionality, and at the same time to make changes directly to the configures data and keep them separate. So, but you can deep link between them. So that's so we're just thinking about what we might be able to do in the R1 timeframe with regard to that. Like when we have the topology resources, NF topology type resources, I think those would clearly go in the Nefio one, whereas package variant set would live in the configures data section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's definitely a decent, I'm not going to pull it up now, but there's a decent documentation within backstage.io. Let's actually open it, talking about, let me expand this window because I think it gets tricky if it's too small, about, what's the difference between an application, Backstage application, what's a plugin, how do you create a plugin, so forth. And obviously I've gone through it too, so I can absolutely help out there. Now, jumping back to the UI, I definitely want to show you where this logic's at, because that's rather important. So we're going to focus directly. Okay, actually, let me show you a couple different things. There's two main folders here that we're going to pay attention to, packages and plugins. Plugins, as it sounds, is these are the plugins or the individual components that we develop that we add on to Backstage. So we have, okay, and one important note too is you can have front end, back end components. You can also have share components. So maybe something that just contains a bunch of interfaces or types that you want to share between the back end and front end. But back and front end are the two main components or plugins. And you can't have a plugin that contains both the UI code as well as like back end code. So essentially here we see that I have two plugins. I have the configures data. This is actually the plugin for the UI itself. So this is the screen that we're seeing right here, as well as I have a separate plugin just because it's required for how Backstage is architectured for a small backend component that the configures data UI requires. And basically, if we would take a look at the source code, just because it is rather simple, we can see that essentially all this does is, that's not the correct file. If we go to router, we can see that beyond a couple helpful functions and a health check is essentially anything that you get, post, or anything you send to this API, it just proxies directly out to Kubernetes. And if we would take a closer look at that, and the reason I have to do this is even though in this example on the left-hand side, the UI hasn't prompted me for authentication. Usually whenever you connect to Kubernetes, you need to have some kind of authentication token or whatnot. So this is the logic that adds a token as well as directly, as well as communicates to the Kubernetes API server. And let's jump to, okay, I'm going to jump back to the CAD UI in a second. If we would look at the packages, this is what defines the Backstage application. Let's actually look at app real quick. And let's see if I remember exactly where this is at. If we look at app.tsx, we can see a couple things. We can see, we can ignore the catalog for the moment, but we can see if we go directly, okay, so this contains all the paths. And essentially, if we hit the backslash path or an empty path, or if we hit slash configures data, this does route to the configures data page, which we can see is imported. This is essentially an alias for the plugins folder. Imports for the plugin that I was just showing you within the plugins CAD folder. So again, anything configures data goes directly to our plugin. Whereas if I hit the settings path, it's going to go to the user settings page. So just to show you real quick, if I would change it here, we can see that navigates to the settings page. And if I would wipe this path out, it's going to redirect this to configures data, which then sends us to the configures data page. And this is kind of, yes.
Yes, can I interrupt? You showed by default it gets the Kubernetes account, so there is no need for the user to log in, right? So when the settings is clicked on the real NFO release 1, when the settings is clicked, do we show the Kubernetes user account and token that is being used, or what will be the scope of the setting, or is it something that we have to think through?
I'm sorry, was it whenever you click on settings or just in general, like do we need to require authentication?
But the authentication is already pre-configured based on Kubernetes token, right?
So there's different, Chris, I think what he's asking, there's different ways to authenticate. Maybe you can show, that's a configuration option, that the way it's set up right now is basically no authentication needed to the UI. The UI authenticates to the Kubernetes cluster with a specific service account. That would be a very bad thing to do in production. It's very useful for development, but the way that what it does support is the ability to authenticate to the UI using different identity providers, and then those and then correct me if I'm wrong here, Chris. That authentication token is then used to authenticate to the Kubernetes cluster underneath. So that works great in, say, GKE, where we have the ability to share the identities between the identity provider and the cluster identities. I don't know about other cluster identity mechanisms in other cloud providers. Presumably they have something similar.
So for release 1, do we plan to have this authentication mechanism from the GUI?
So it's a configuration option. I think we should discuss. It's a good question. If we're talking about our sandbox environment, then probably no, because it's just a sandbox environment. But when we're talking about installing it in a real environment, then certainly something like that would be preferred, but it's going to vary with that environment. It's not something we can, something we'd have to offer during installation as, okay, you need to set up your Okta or your Google OIDC or whatever it is And then it's up to an administrator of the Nefio system to ensure that the identities that are being used to authenticate against the UI are also identities that exist and have an authorization and a Kubernetes role associated with them in the cluster. And that's sort of beyond the scope of what we can ensure or configure, because we don't know what cluster provider they'd be using in that case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think it also takes us to a deeper point, like which user will have access to edit the package, which user will have access to approve the package, things like that.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes it even more complex. So I think that's something that we have to define.
And I think in R1, we're basically just ignoring all of that.
Okay, sounds good.
But that's a huge area of, remember we talked about, maybe you don't, I don't know well, anyway, at one point we talked about with SIG 1, hey, what are the roles? And, we sort of are moving forward with an assumption of a certain set of roles, but we're not really doing a particularly, R1 is more about demonstrating certain capabilities, and so we're not really pursuing that right now, but it definitely needs to be there eventually.
Okay, yeah, understood the scope then. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and that part I did skip over. Yeah, so exactly what John says, like authentication. Right now it is configurable for the past Nefio demo, as well as it sounds like with R1, is we'll be able to use the Kubernetes API, or we'll be able to use the service account associated with the pod that Nefio is hosted on. But we do support, and it's documented within the backend plugin. So just plugins, CAD backend, what authentication methods are supported. So if I go to auth provider, search on this for a second, and this I'm sure we're gonna have to extend out by all means. But right now we support just using the current context that pretty much the deployment's running under the service account. We can use Google authentication, as well as we do have some OIDC support. But right now that's limited to Okta and then Google OIDC. Service account, I actually should remove this. This was pulled in from a, what is that? Another project within Backstage where this is able to use a static token to connect to the Kubernetes API server. But I believe right now all tokens expire. So this wouldn't be helpful if we need the UI to work more than a couple hours. Okay, jumping back. And it is worth noting too, like today, you can't enable authentication. Right now, the UI has no authorization, meaning either you have full access or no access. So once we get to that point, that's something that we would need to add in. And Backstage, I know is under development last time I looked at it, which would have been about 3 or 4 months ago, but they are looking at adding in some support. They had a project and a proof of concept project showing how you can potentially add in authorization within Backstage itself, down to the plugin level where we can implement it, or we can create our own scheme. But that's kind of worth noting too. Jumping back to what I wanted to show you is essentially anything starting with the path config as data gets redirected to the config as data page. That takes us to the plugins. I just wanted to point that out because this becomes important to understand. Just how do we enter the plugin? And then once we dive into the plugin itself, so the config as data plugin open, and let me just clap some of the other windows. Okay, source code is where the majority of the logics, or as it sounds, it's where all the source code's at. So let's just go over the folders real quickly. The APIs folder, this is anything essentially anything that needs to make an HTTP call has to go through the files, the classes within this folder. So this is using some of the backstage setup. Essentially, is we have one file that defines the configures data API. This defines the interface. And this is just following a backstage convention where we list out all the various API calls that we want to make. So we can look at one in particular, list repositories. So we can see that this returns a repository type of type promise. And then if I would go to the Porch REST API, I can see the actual implementation. So we can see that we're just doing a fetch against essentially the Kubernetes API. So it's sending it to the CAD backend, which then forwards it to the API server, just listing out all the repositories. Now, once we get to the components, this is where we can see essentially this folder contains all the individual pages, including this page that we're viewing here. I'll show you how it gets there in a moment, as well as control. Okay, so we have, let's go to the package management page. This happens to be the page we're on at the moment. So if I search for package management, we can see this is the title that we see at the very top. So this contains pages. This is kind of good to point out is, let me enter the team blueprints. Is at the bottom is we can see the resource viewer dialog, edit dialog. So the resource viewer is whenever we click on a individual resource within the package, it's actually entering this component right here. So this is what contains all this logic here for the viewer, as well as seeing the YAML view. And similar, whenever we go to edit, it's within this dialog too, or this component. So these are top level components just because they have to be used in a couple places. Additionally, we also have controls. And what this is for is essentially just basic controls that we want on a page. So if we want a checkbox, a chip, a radio group, these are helpful controls that we can use. It's also good to point out that Backstage, they do have a storybook where we can see the components that Backstage has as well. So I can expand this real quick. So we can see that Backstage has, let's look at this, a status component. So if we would want to use that, or actually one that we use all over the place, this probably looks familiar, is the table component. So this is helpful to see what the components look like, see what they are. And if there happens not to be a component here, is Backstage, they use the material UI components. So let's pull that up. Which is now mapped over to MUI, but I believe we're using a slightly older version of these components, but it's still very helpful. I mean, this is fairly accurate. If we would look at the React components of Material UI, we can actually see all the various components, see what they look like. And I'm not sure why that's not loading at the moment. Okay, that's interesting. Usually it does load. But essentially, that's kind of the component suite that we have available. As a general rule, what we want to do first is essentially these controls were created for a purpose. Even if Backstage had one, either we need to update, I had to update the styling of the component, or to have enough functionality for what we needed. So as a general rule, if we have a control within our own repository, we'll want to use that first. Then we'll fall back to the Backstage controls components. And then at worst, we can fall back to what the Material UI components have. And it's definitely not a must, but kind of, at least in my mind, that's the order of preference I've been going down as far as like determining what control to use. Okay, moving on, types is essentially, and this could be restructured, but this is something I did initially and it's just stayed, I've never changed it since. Essentially, this contains any kind of resource that we interact with, any kind of Kubernetes resource that we interact, or any kind of helpful types that we have that span multiple components or multiple forms. I've been just putting here is if we would look at let's look at the deployment component. We can see that this closely represents the YAML. We got API version, kind metadata spec, whereas in the spec we just exploded out. So just a place where we can add all the JavaScript types to that can be shared across multiple components. And then further down is we got utilities. So utilities, basically these are just like helper functions, essentially functions that we need to use, okay, similar to the types across multiple components. So we can take a quick look at maybe repository, see what's in here. And we can see, okay, I have a number of helpful functions to tell me, okay, what kind of repository is it? Is it a package repository? Is it a deployment repository, which is a type of a package repository? Or is it a function repository? As well as, is the repository resource ready within Porch itself? So just number of helper functions. I know if we scroll down with a few of these two is, we can see definitely a little bit more involved methods, including, let me see if I can find one. Well, okay. But essentially the gist is, again, just anything that's any kind of code that we want to use across multiple components or multiple pages. This can be a good place for the code to exist, just so it can be shared easily. Now let's jump back to components. Is actually maybe a little bit higher is if we take a look at the routes. This is following a backstage convention. And this is actually, I haven't had to do it yet just because we have a single plugin, but this allows us to enable deep linking among multiple plugins. So once we have a Netflix specific plugin, we have this config as data plugin, we'll actually be able to use these route references, reference it from the other plugin and do deep linking. And essentially what these routes do is, or this library right here is, it defines all the various paths that exist within the plugin. So if we jump back to the UI, I'm gonna back up a little bit. I'm gonna see how I can do this with the font size being a little bit smaller. Is let's go into a particular repository. Okay, so we can see here is we got the path config as data. We already know from looking at the Backstage application that routes to our config as data UI plugin. And then we have repositories and deployments one. So, okay, that's actually excellent. So we can see right here is we have a repository route ref where it lists out the repository. Okay, the path is repositories, as well as the dynamic or repository name placeholder variable. And we can take a quick look to see where this is referenced at. And the main reference I'm looking for is within the landing page. Let's go here. And if I expand this out, I can see that for the given route, for this repository's route ref, it's going to map to the repository page. And if I jump to or the repository page component or element, and if I jump here, we can see that took me to the repository page within components. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see, what do we have? Okay, the title of the page happens to be the repository name. And then we also have two tabs, the package descriptor. Essentially, what this package descriptor means is it deployments, is it team blueprints, organizational blueprints, or external blueprints, as well as a tab that says that has the advanced label. So we can take a quick look and just see if it lines up, and we can see immediately, okay, the name of the screen or the page happens to match up with the name of the repository. We do see tabs. One's named after the package descriptor, as well as the advanced tab. So I'm just trying to show you just how the routing system works. And again, this config as data, that's defined in the main Backstage application. So that's why it's not repeated here. And if we would, let me just do one more, just to show you repositories register. If we would go ahead and change the URL directly. See that this maps the register repository screen, and let's just trace this quickly. Find all references, we'll go back to the landing page, and we can see exactly which page this maps to. So hopefully the naming's not too much of a surprise. And likewise, if we come to the very bottom, we should be able to see what title is being shown. So register repository, which maps up with exactly what we see on the screen. And then this is a backstage component here, the simple stepper that allows us to step forward and backwards through this workflow. So what would be, I'm going to throw a question back to you guys. From this point is I wanted to show you the mapping or the URLs, how they translate to the components being showed. Do you want me to dive into an API call, or what do you think would be best for me to show you next? Or is there anything that's very unclear at this moment?
Well, I guess, Chris, yeah, whatever you think is best.
Okay,
Yeah, that's probably good to see how the API call works and how one might
sure.
debug it. And
I think Sahir unmuted himself, but we were not able to hear if in case.
oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't hear anything. Okay. Can you maybe put it in chat, Sahir? If for some reason we can't hear you, we could hear you earlier.
Yeah, I can see Sahir is unmuting, but I couldn't hear. Yeah. Maybe we can add it on chat room as well, Sahir. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and if, or let me know if something comes across chat, because I won't see it on my screen.
There's nothing yet, so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I can start going into one. You know what, actually, I know exactly. We'll do a couple things. So let me show you a little bit more. I'm going to dive into a particular form. So John, I'm trying to remember, the main ask for the first release is adding support for package variant viewer and editor. Is that correct? Or at least one of the asks?
So the thing that I would want to see is actually package variant set editor and viewer, and a package variant viewer more. Obviously, ideally an editor too, but people aren't generally going to be creating package variants directly or editing them directly. They're generally going to be created by the package variant set, because a package variant on its own just manages one package.
Mhm.
Not all that interesting. So yeah, so adding that editor viewer for a package variant set is kind of the biggest ask.
Okay. Let me find, I'm trying to find. This doesn't look too bad. Okay. So for the app, okay, let me jump to the resource viewers. So I'm going to select, I'm trying to find a good resource. This could use the ingress. Okay, so whenever we click on a row here, we can see that the resource viewer opens up, and then yes, we're going to need to add support for the package variant set. And since I know that's one of the asks, is I'll actually dive a little bit deeper into how the resource viewers work. So I have a resource open, happens to be an ingress. Let's look at this code. So we have the resource viewer dialog, and let me close all the other windows. And then this is a convention I've seen within the other Backstage plugins. Usually index just references out to another file that contains the logic. So in this case, I'm going to follow it the whole way, just so I'm not jumping all over the place, is we have the resource viewer dialog. And essentially, let's scroll down. And I basically, what I want to trace down is like, how does essentially, how does this form get generated, the screen, and how does it determine what information to show? Okay, so just taking a closer look at the dialogue itself, which makes sense because we saw this pop open on the screen, is we have two different views. We have the YAML view, which happens to be, this view is right here, as well as what I'm calling at the moment, the formatted or the first class viewer. So the show YAML view, whenever we first loaded the page, we actually saw this, which is part of the first class viewer selector. Let's see if we can figure out why real quick. And it's a Boolean, so by default, yeah, the Booleans, okay, it's not as explicit here, but it would be false by default, so it would come into this first class viewer selector. And essentially what gets passed into this form is the YAML for the resource. Okay, I'm taking the YAML, essentially I'm loading it up so I can get a JSON representation. From the JSON representation, I'm able to pull out the kind API version. And essentially all that gets passed into this first class viewer selector. So let's actually dive into where that's at. So this is within a components folder within the resource viewer dialog. It's not a first level component just because it's only used within this dialog screen. It's not shared among the other components. So we can see it's calling the structured metadata, but before that is whenever we first enter is we get the group version kind and we pass it to this custom metadata function. So we can take a quick look at this. And we can see, so this is an ingress. Okay, group version kind of be networking, KHIOV1 ingress. Let's see if we can find that. I'm just gonna search for ingress. And it's basically hitting this method right here to get ingress structured metadata. And here what we can see, what it's doing is, okay, I'm mapping it to the type of ingress. It just essentially defines how everything looks. And essentially is I'm starting to pull out key fields from the YAML. So I can say, and the way that these, sorry. The way that the structured metadata works is that it takes in essentially a JSON representation, a key value pair, and that's what creates this table that we see here. So the key here be class name, the value be Nginx, and then it actually allows a little bit of additional embedding, which I'm not sure if I have here. This might not be a great example, but where you can have within the key value pair, you can actually have another key value pair on the right-hand side. So essentially that's what this custom function is trying to form is I start creating a key value pair. We can see that we have class name. The keys, they do get formatted by the structured viewer. So I forget if this is camel case or whatnot. It does get converted into what I believe they call capitalized case, or at least where they separate out the individual words determined by the case. Since we see the capital N, this is going to be separated out into two words with the first letter capitalized. So we can look at what else we do with the custom metadata here. Is we can see whenever we loop by, get back in, it's actually, just want to make sure I remember how this looks like. So we got TLS. So we can see, okay, if there's ingress spec TLS, well, what do we want to do? We want to loop across all the entries within that array. And essentially we want, After the TLS's name, it looks like we want to add what secrets are being used, as well as some other light information. So if we come back here, we can see secret name, example TLS, as well as a path. And if we go a little bit further, we should see that we do something for the ingress roles too, where we have roles. We can see example package catalog, the paths, and we can see that there's a little bit of a logic right here, creating that structure too for the various ingress roles. There happens to be one ingress role, so we just title it ingress role, but this passed back a object, which essentially gets passed into the structured metadata, which gets formatted right here. Okay, and this was actually part of the class I was looking for, so I forgot I had extra layer right here. So that custom method we were looking at adds everything essentially below the annotations that adds in the class name, TLS, ingress. Every time that we call this component, we always get the general metadata for the component, which adds in the resource, the namespace, labels, and annotations. And I think that's part of this get metadata for resource. Which I'm having problems tracing, but we can see, okay, yes, yeah, again, it adds in the resource name, namespace, labels, annotations. So this you always get for free. And then this information is added by that custom logic that we found by looking at the viewer selector component. One thing that's kind of important to note is you see, or at least like right now it's just a regular JSON object. There's no fancy formatting, anything around that. One big reason for that is, let me jump back. I think I need to let's look at the Ghost application. One thing that the UI does allow you to do is comparisons. And essentially, you can look at the differences between like one revision of a package to a more recent revision. So if we open this back up, and this is a perfect example here, and this is part of the reason why it's just a plain JSON component, at least for the reason, is it allows us to do pretty much the text to see if anything within the JSON component was updated, so we can more easily show the diff. And just kind of like what I was talking about before is if we go to the Backstage Storybook, we can see, yeah, the structured metadata table. It's a component that we're using from Backstage, just what the component looks like. My screen's a little bit small, so it's hard to see, or I'm not sure if it's fully open. But essentially like example usages as well too. So you can see, okay, it's taking in the description format, or I'm sorry, the JSON object and exactly how it's formatting it. And in certain cases, like with the booleans, it automatically translates it to various icons. And quickly, let me show you an API call, just so we can wrap that side up. Is we're going to open up, give me a moment. Actually, probably the best. So I'm just trying to think of the quickest screen, or at least the easiest screen. Let's look into this repositories list real quick. This might be the quickest. Let's see if we can find this real quick. Package management. I don't know why I had to search that. So we got the package management page. So right here, package management. We have tabs. I clicked on the repositories tab. So let's look at the component. Tab component. And I just realized, okay, the way this gets generated is I pass in the repository summaries into this component. I actually want to see where that's pulled from. So let me back up. I didn't realize I was actually directly on this page. Is the way that we make an API call is, so this is documented within Backstage itself. But if you remember within the APIs folder is where the interface that defines the API calls, the implementation. We always deal with the interface. The way we get a reference to the API is by using this use API function. And again, this is within Backstage itself, where we pass in the interface. So we want the configures data API reference. We get the API back. And then here I'm able to say, let's list out all the repositories. And again, essentially, if I follow this in, it's going to go to the interface. And if I look at the REST API, that's perfect. List repositories. We can see exactly the call that's going to be making to the back end. And then we can see that I'm using right here one of the helper functions to actually reform, to be able to take that JSON response, format it so the UI is able to consume it a little bit easier. And likewise, we see another API call for listing out the package revisions. Part of the reason that Backstage has this use API concept is so if we would develop whenever we develop the second Nepio component, if for whatever reason we want to reuse some of the APIs that's defined within this component, the configures data UI, this actually allows us to reference APIs developed within other plugins. So yeah, so it's a little bit different from a standard project, but the good news is it's very straightforward to use, and past using the use API convention and having the interfaces, everything else is completely normal to use. There's not too many surprises there. And I think we're about out of time. Is there any questions? Is this enough to hopefully help get you guys started, get rolling?
So here, I see you unmuted, but again, we can't hear you, unfortunately.
Are you, can you check if you're double muted, Sahir?
Well,
So John, like I just wanted to add a point. Like, yeah, thank you, Chris, for taking the time to explain. And from I just saw Sahir's text in the middle, and then the different chat room. Like, so I think the overall architecture I was able to understand, but there were so many Kubernetes specific constructs, right? The term like GVK, the term deployment, ingress, they're all like Kubernetes specific constructs. So being purely UI developers without having background on Kubernetes, I think it's gonna, we will have some internal discussions to go through the basics on those, and then I think the video is gonna definitely be very useful for us to revisit and catch up with something that was left out, like because there were so many Kubernetes specific terms, like the service account, there's so many these terms were used. I think we will definitely need to brush up on them with members, and then we will revisit. But it was definitely a very useful session for us. Yeah.
And I'm sure what we can do too is just to help lower because you're right, there is a good bit of Kubernetes things in here. We can probably try to lower that as much as possible, at least for the initial R1. Is like we can also have, and I didn't dive too much into it, is we can also we can have a package already set up with the package variant sets, resources added. Just so instead of like having to learn all of Kubernetes, understand ports, understand the cloning, having to create some of the stuff yourself where it's already almost pre-configured. And that would,
Yeah, like I think that the key piece, like it's not really important to understand what a deployment is or even what a package variant set is, but understanding the structure of Kubernetes API resources, the GVK, what like that's the, you know, what metadata versus spec, and just that general concept, and not so much what it's used for, but just like the YAML structure, the schema, because a lot of this is about editing instances of those types of resources. That would be probably a good place to start.
I agree. Yeah, that's something that we will internally like coordinate as well. So moving forward, is there anything I remember, John, like you said, you have to brush up the existing workshop repo by removing some of the icons or etc. Is there anything that I think
Well,
I think once we get hands-on, it will help us. You know, it will help
yeah,
us
I think
go.
we actually don't need to do that because what we found, what Chris said is that all those changes that we wanted to remove are in a separate branch, and we don't actually even, we just basically will go back to the main branch. But we're actually late for the other call, so let's follow up on that, Ganesh. I think that probably starting by just setting up the environment and poking around in there is a place to start. Yeah, but let's maybe talk about that another time because I got to go start the other call.
Yes, sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much, Chris. Super awesome.
Thanks,
And-
Chris.
Yep.
I promise. See ya. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.